Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Robert, thank you for the kind opening comments. In our limited time today, we want to have not a monologue, but a dialogue with you. And I'm going to try and get that dialogue going with just a couple of brief remarks. Then introduce my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Rick Harper and Dr. Jerry Parrish. Fourth member of our Florida Council of Economic Advisors, Dr. Tony Villamil, who I know many of you know, is unable to be with us today. You know, he's suffering from the flu bug that's going around in South Florida. So let me just start by putting a couple of thoughts out there very quickly. In preparation for today's meeting, I went to ProQuest, which is just a search engine, and I typed in a U.S. economic recession. And that is, it returned in every print, broadcast, and social media article through November 26th of this year that had as a headline, U.S. economic recession. You can see so far this year we had over 38,000 hits or search results. That's about a 25% increase over the prior 2 years. So the point is there's a lot of chatter out there about whether or not the U.S. economy is going to go into a recession. And that's the issue that Drs. Harper and Parrish are going to be talking with you a little bit more in just a couple of minutes. In that regard, this second chart kind of brings home what they're going to be talking about. The red line is job growth in Florida, dating all the way back to the early 1990s. The blue line is job growth in the U.S. economy. A couple of things that are worthwhile to point out. First, the red line, when it's rising, is rising more than the blue line. But also when the lines are declining, that is during economic recessions, there is more of a decline in the red line, which is Florida, than in the rest of the country. Indeed, toward the bottom of the slide there is a little equation. It says Florida's job growth is equal to 0.24. That is, we go up by 0.25%, regardless what happens in the rest of the country, plus 1.4 times U.S. job growth. So for every 1 percentage point by which U.S. job growth changes, we change by 40% more of that. So we do much better than the economy as a whole during economic expansions like we've been in, but we don't do nearly as well, or we do much worse in the economy during economic contractions. My colleagues will talk more about that. Let me introduce them. I think we're going to have just a few couple quick comments on the international economy next by both Dr. Harper and Dr. Parrish. I've known Rick Harper for a number of years now. Rick is a distinguished professor emeritus from the University of West Florida, where he retired just recently to take over the Deepwater Port BP activities associated with that spill several years ago. He's the economic advisor for all of that. Long time sought after consultant from members of the political elected officials as well as business sector in Florida. Seated next to Rick is Dr. Jerry Parrish. Dr. Parrish is Director of Economic Research and Chief Economist for the Florida Chamber of Commerce, as many of you know. Dr. Parrish is therefore based in Tallahassee. His expertise is Florida. Dr. Parrish is going to be talking about the Florida economy in a few minutes. But first, Dr. Harper is going to talk about the global and the national outlook. Just on the global side, I'll come back to that in a minute. So what Dr. Villamil was going to mention, global outlook, Tony was thinking, is a little bit of an improvement, but not a whole lot. So from that point of view, maybe we're not looking for a whole lot different in 2020 than we have been looking at. Few items, bullet points Tony wanted to make, that slowdowns abroad can and do affect us here, as you can see. Modest pickup is likely in 2020, but there are some downside risks, which you'll hear more about in a minute. Trade policy is a big issue, and we've all got to keep our eyes on that. So with that kind of as background, Florida is sensitive to what goes on in the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Who better than two experts on the rest of the country and the rest of the world than rest of Florida, rest of the country than Doctors Harper and Parrish? Rick?
Thanks, Steve. Do you have the clicker?
No, there's no
it's
clicker,
over here.
but I will.
Correct. Whoops. Back one.
Back one.
Backspace. Yeah, there we go. So we are now in what is the longest expansion ever. 10 years and 6 months now, and it's a wonderful thing. Unemployment is at historically low levels. The economy looks strong, but I say 10 years and 6 months to emphasize that the expansion's getting a little long in the tooth. There are some pressures out there, particularly in the labor market, that will lead, as inevitably happens, to the next recession. We haven't tamed the business cycle yet, but hopefully we have got more room to run with the current expansion. We're at full employment, both in Florida, as we've already heard, and in the U.S., and we're seeing labor market growth measured as the number of net new jobs per month slowing. We've got to get at least 135,000 per month in the U.S. economy to avoid the unemployment rate going up. We're still stronger than that, and the labor market is tight. However, immigration is falling. That's a risk for us and for Florida particularly, and especially for some areas of South Florida. And so we would like to see immigration rise, but we'd like to see it rise in the right way. We need to emulate Canada, perhaps, and move to a smarter immigration policy where we encourage smart, talented, skilled people to stay, but perhaps tighten up immigration, the family immigration that's characterized the U.S. for so many decades. Consumer spending continues to be the major driver. We are seeing some weakness in manufacturing. When I wrote that manufacturing may not be as weak as feared, we had just seen a good number on business equipment spending last week. We'd seen a good number on the trade deficit, that imports had decreased and lowered the trade deficit. However, today we got a little bit of a disaster on the Institute for Supply Management. They ask purchasing managers for businesses whether they're going to expand their purchases in the coming 6 months or contract them. And we just had today the fourth straight month of declines in the Institute for Supply Management, and that was true for purchasing managers' reports on what they plan to do for equipment purchases, for hiring, and for production. Inventories didn't look good either, so scratch that statement about manufacturing not being as weak as feared. Housing, we've still got house prices rising, but we do not have a glut of inventory, unlike in 2005 and 2006, when home prices went up really in a more speculative fashion. Now they're rising because of limited supply. That's true across the nation. It's also true in Florida. We came in with a $984 billion deficit at the federal level for the fiscal year that ended September 30th. And if you divide that by the roughly 330 million people in the United States, that's $3,000 in federal government borrowing per man, woman, and child in the U.S. So your family of four, the federal government is on your behalf borrowing $12,000 this past fiscal year. That's why we have a $984 billion deficit. We're going to have a $1 trillion deficit as far as the eye can see. That's because people, believe it or not, are aging. The baby boomers are aging out of the workforce, and so they're going to be collecting Social Security. People are going to be collecting Medicare, and if the economy does indeed slow down, then you're going to see more people collecting on Medicaid. So the federal government budget deficit will rise. It will be more than $1 trillion a year for as far as the eye can see. GDP growth is at 2.1%. I'll say more about that in the next slide. 6-month recession risk, however, continues to be low. The index of leading indicators does not point to a recession as Jerry will say, either in Florida or in the U.S. During the next 6 months. So that's a good thing. The Fed is going to hold interest rates steady, at least for now. They're probably done with the easing cycle because there are upside risks, but inflation is not yet where the Fed wants it to be. They'd like inflation to be higher than it is. It's not there. So inflation's below target. And as Steve mentioned just a moment ago, the near-term downside risks, tariffs, lack of a China trade deal, we're getting ready to move ahead with steel and aluminum tariffs on Brazil and Argentina. That's a bit of bad news. Longer-term growth risks, productivity growth slowdown, decreased international trade, and decreased immigration. Next slide. And that you can see here. This goes all the way back to 1948. And if you were to draw think back to your statistics class, if you were to draw a trend line through those data, it would slope downward to the right, wouldn't it? And so what we see on the right-hand side of that chart, and this is current through Q2 of 2019, is that the trend rate, the long-term growth rate of gross domestic product on an inflation-adjusted basis has been declining over time because, as we heard mentioned, the GI Bill, that many people have used it. But we're losing our competitive edge in terms of the American advantage in education relative to other nations, right? So that was a source of productivity growth. And in terms of population growth, baby boomers we had the millennial generation as our kids, but millennials have not yet had enough kids. And so the replacement rate for the economy, every family should have at least 2.1 children on average, some fewer, some more. We're not there. We're at about 1.7 children per family. And thus, how do we make up the gap? Because GDP growth comes from two things. Either you make your existing workers more productive. Productivity growth depends on skills, better factories, business investment, but we're not getting the business investment. And it depends on the number of people who are producing things and buying things as consumers. And so if the population isn't growing fast enough domestically, then you've got to import those people. And we've, for decades, had the advantage of being the place that everybody wants to come. We need to preserve that advantage. We clearly need to restructure immigration. But from an economics perspective, it is a huge mistake to limit immigration in substantial ways, although we do have to restructure it to make it more favorable to our interests, because you get a barbell effect, that immigrants come in two sorts. They come from family chain migration, where through humanitarian actions, we bring the poorest people and their parents, their brothers, sisters, and kids. And we also bring the smartest people because they come here for graduate school and they may end up getting an H-1B visa and staying and becoming immigrants. So we need to fix those things. And with that, I'll turn it over to my good colleague and friend, Jerry.
Thank you, Dr. Harper.
Yep.
Dr. Parrish.
Thanks, Steve and Rick. I want to talk about, y'all have heard some of the metrics about Florida already. Senator Lemieux mentioned some at lunch. One of them is that Florida is now a $1.08 trillion economy. And they're not kidding. The 17th largest in the world. And you should notice that there's a lot of countries that are in front of us that have 120 and 200 million people each. Actually, the next one we would jump over would be Indonesia. I believe they got 220 million people versus Florida. Their GDP per capita is about a little over $3,000. So it's kind of hard to compete against those. But what's interesting about these statistics is, and nobody realizes this, is Florida's got a higher per capita GDP than Germany. And most people don't realize that, but we're a big deal. We are a big deal. Third largest economy. One of the interesting things about Florida is some of the things that are shown here on the Florida scorecard. This is the front page. If you went to thefloridascorecard.org, you can see there's a live population counter. Now, it's not going to change because this is a screenshot, so don't expect it to change, but it will change on your phone or on your tablet. A couple other things in there. Certainly, we've got job numbers and things like third grade reading scores, a lot of stuff that are important to Florida's future. But what I like to talk about is this income migration. 989,000. This is the second one on the left in there. $989,000 moves into Florida every single hour of every single day. That's an annual number. That's that number on your 1040 form. If you file your taxes, which we hope you do, or you're an accountant, you know what I'm talking about. That is so important to the state of Florida. Why? Florida runs on sales taxes. About 76% or so of our general revenue comes from sales and use taxes. It's a good way to run a state, actually. It's more efficient to tax consumption than it is income or inputs to business. So that's important. That money, that comes from How Money Walks. If you've read that book, if you click on the little tile, it'll send you to their website. You can see where your county, top 5 places you gain, people weighted by income from, and lose people too. In most cases, Florida is green. We're gaining money from other states. Certainly, that number will go up when they calculate it again because of the tax bill that was passed early last year. A lot more high net wealth individuals moving to the state of Florida. Poverty rates, those kind of things are on there. But one thing I want to show you, it's not on here, but if you click on the business climate and competitiveness pillar on there, every 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is a calculation of a probability of a Florida recession. Now, when I used to work for a tax watch, about 5 years ago, I left Florida Tax Watch. Before that, I wrote a couple of papers that showed really that Florida's last recession, the Great Recession, started earlier and lasted nearly twice as long as the U.S. recession. You always hear about the U.S. recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research's dating committee, about 9 months after the recession starts, they come out and say, hey, a recession started about 9 months ago. And about 6 months after it's over, they say, hey, the recession ended on this such and such a date. Well, there's nobody to call a Florida recession. But, I calculated what it was, produced a little paper at Tax Watch, and really what it showed was not only twice as long, 35 months versus 18 months for the U.S., it was more than twice as deep. And if you were living in Florida, you remember what it's like. Somebody lost their house, lost their car. The good thing is about Florida, it's not been that long ago. There's a big article in the Wall Street Journal in 2007 that says, is Florida over? Wow, what a great thing to see. If you're, I talked to people that work at the Florida Chamber during that time, and they were beside themselves. But roll that back one, if you don't mind, Steve. I'm going to talk about that one in a minute. Back one slide, if you would. Okay. All right, let's talk about, I want to talk about some of the threats here of Florida. Certainly, there's a big threat of losing our momentum in economic development. That's one of the things. In 2014, the Wall Street Journal headline says, has Florida found the secret to saving the economy? And I credit our new governor back in 2011, Rick Scott, and that 11, 12, 13, and 14 legislature. They really made Florida, they signaled to all businesses around the country and around in other countries that Florida was going to be a friendly place to move private capital. And when you invest private capital, people will go to work. And we're still benefiting from that, even though our legislature has sent signals that, hey, we don't want to do that anymore. Certainly that's cost us a substantial amount of job creation. The next big threat, as I see it, is the proposed constitutional amendment, this Florida, this minimum wage, $15 an hour. I made this slide just to show you how substantial these proposed increases are. If that constitutional amendment ends up on the ballot, a lot of people say if it ends up on the ballot, it'll probably pass. It sounds good. Everybody wants people to make more money. However, look at the increases, proposed increases compared to history. Our economic models are pretty good that we use. If you change something by 5 or 10%, you get a pretty good answer. I mean, you're talking about the first jump is 18% increase. We're already substantially above the U.S. We're, nearly 17% above the U.S. minimum wage. I teach at FSU part-time. I have a bunch of great grad students every year. I gave them this problem to teach as their final project. And what they came up with, if you follow the Congressional Budget Office, their numbers would show Florida's, loss of that 1.3 to 1.8 million jobs is going to be 250,000 jobs we'll lose. if you actually think about those are the direct jobs and throw it through a multiplier model and have to count the indirect and induced, it's more than 500,000 jobs that we're going to lose if this thing passes. Who gets hurt the worst? Poor people get hurt the worst. People with low skills get hurt the worst. This is about the worst thing we can do as we try to help people get out of poverty. Last thing I'll say here is one of our goals at the Florida Chamber Foundation with our Florida 2030 project is, there's more than 900,000 kids living in poverty in the state of Florida right now. Our goal is to have that, to have less than 10% of the, kids living in Florida living in poverty. And this obviously is a big, big threat. You can throw everything out the window, all this great job creation we've been doing. If this thing passes and gets implemented, and especially that big jump, it is a substantial jump. And I'm going to tell you, it's going to hurt people with low skills the worst. Thanks, Steve.
Let me just summarize our remarks by one final slide that I think captures both what Dr. Harper and Dr. Parrish were mentioning and what I also alluded to. We need to be humble as economists. We get humbled just about every day, as Dr. Harper alluded to. We don't know as a profession everything that causes recessions. We do have some ideas. We think recessions occur when we get policy mistakes, like monetary policy that's too tight for too long, usually preceded by monetary policy that's been too easy for too long. Right now, I think the status of that to me looks like it's neutral. Policy isn't too tight, it isn't too easy, it's kind of about just right, we think. So then fiscal policy mistakes can and have thrown our economy into recessions. It's like if we got a large decrease in government spending without accompanying tax decreases, that would likely push us into a recession. What I see here that worries me, that Dr. Harper alluded to, I think, is that federal spending continues to rise, even though federal tax receipts continue to rise too. And the gap seems to be growing rather than narrowing. So that's an issue that we have to address as a nation. It's a bipartisan issue. Regulatory, as our speaker from the FCC mentioned, regulation can be damaging to industries and economies. I think that's one of the bright lights in our economy now. See two numbers, green, 59 and 121. 59 is the number of new pages of significant regulation in 2017 and 18, first 2 years of the current administration, versus 121, which occurred in the first 2 years of the previous administration. The regulation, in some sense, is being cut in half. International trade policies, you all remember smooth Harley tariffs from our favorite movie or something like that, or a morning lecture. So from the policy point of view, things look okay. What about imbalances in key sectors? 2005, when we were here, I remember writing an article, is there a bubble in your house? Nobody read the damn thing? No. Some of us didn't have the good sense to short all the construction and real estate we could get our hands on. But there don't appear right now to be any big imbalances I can see, but I'd like your comments on that. I do worry about $120+ trillion of unfunded federal liabilities for Social Security, for Medicare, for all kinds of other things like that. I don't know what in the world negative interest rates mean. I mean, that to an economist, I don't understand that. Non-investment grade debt. Those of you who own Netflix and companies like that, you got to pray for the bond markets, right? That's a company financially leveraged up to the hilt with non-investment grade debt. China's financial sector. I remember reading several years ago somebody saying China keeps data on their banking sector. They can make it up as they go along. I don't know if that's fact or fiction. And then last but not least, what are we going to be talking about this summer that none of us are talking about now? that's material, that's significant, that's having an effect. I wish I had that crystal ball to see it. Maybe my colleagues do, maybe some of you do. So with that, we have time to open it up to your comments, questions. Yes, sir. Bill.
So I heard Dr. Harper mention the boomers. I heard Dr. Harper mention the boomers retiring and dipping into Medicare. How is that going to impact that they're not contributing anymore to retirement programs and the access to capital?
It's one of the biggest things that's going to drive the budget deficit up over time. The earliest birth year for the boomers is 46. Therefore, they're turning 73 this year, the first boomers. And as we begin to draw our promised social benefits, you've heard the phrase, keep your government hands off my Medicare. And so being a huge voting bloc, seniors vote in every election from dog catcher to president. So there's no way that the government can decrease those benefits. You look at the things that they spend money on, the 5 top programs at the federal government from a dollar perspective: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, national defense, and interest on the debt. And of those, 4 are viewed as contractual obligations you cannot default on. But I think Medicaid is going to be where the big push is going to come to see those benefits decrease.
So also, I wanted to touch on the say 401ks and things like that. With that much capital no longer in the system, for people like me that have a few years before we retire, it's going to get really expensive to get in those markets. And should we all be investing right now? And then what about that capital? Because a lot of those 401k plans use that capital to invest in places like Florida.
And the other place that we invest is in our owner-occupied homes. And so there's going to be a lot of those on the market as baby boomers move back halfway to be with their kids, their adult kids, or to their retirement home. So what's going to happen to Florida retirement community real estate? Article in the Wall Street Journal this past week, I believe, was about Deltona and pointing out those sorts of problems. And then, of course, the Fed has engineered an asset bubble of enormous magnitude in the stock market, because if you can't earn any return on fixed income assets because they're holding interest rates down just as low as they possibly can, then we all have to run to the stock market chasing returns. So that's a risk. And so these demographic bumps, these waves associated with different generations, create generation-specific risks. And I agree with you that when the Fed does raise interest rates, then you'll see people moving out of the stock market. And so I think it's risky to create those bubbles.
Yeah. Max Olegario, Bank of America. It's actually an entree to what Mr. Harper was talking about with regards to rising interest rates. Well, you mentioned that you think rates are going to hold steady for right now. I for one, agree with that as well. In the Wall Street Journal today, they mentioned that the only way they think that interest rates will rise is if GDP is over 2% for an extended period of time, 6 to 9 months or whatever that should be. In what environment do you feel the Fed will lower interest rates next year from an economic perspective? Then the second part to my question is regards to negative interest rates. 2000, there was $0 in negative interest rate debt out there. Now there's over $7 trillion. Do you ever see the administration's pushing for it? Well, certain people in the administration are pushing for negative interest rates. Do you ever see a point where we get to that point?
You know, being a former Fed economist, I still keep a little bit of a hand in this. Max, I don't see the Federal Reserve moving the Fed funds rate down unless what Rick was mentioning about purchasing manager surveys turn into much slower growth in jobs and much more weakness in GDP growth. So I think they'll keep Fed funds rate, overnight interbank borrowing and lending rate at about where it is now. To get in a substantial pickup on the longer end of the yield curve, we need capital to resume its growth and being productive. Rick mentioned that just business capital spending, CapEx, is pretty flat now. It has been. And that's worrisome to me. At the end of the day, interest rates reflect the productivity of capital. It comes from innovation and things like that. And if we're not getting businesses out there making those capital expenditures, they're not getting the productivity growth. The only way they can get it is reorganizing the existing deck chairs in a different way, but not increasing the size and things like that. So that bothers me. And I worry that negative rates we're seeing in like Switzerland, Germany, Japan reflect something much deeper. Something is wrong with capital investment in those countries. And that bothers me for long-term economic outcomes.
Hi, thank you. So I have two questions. The first was, I saw on one of the slides that you all predicted that there would be an increase of 5 million Floridians in the next 10 years. And I'm just wondering what the demographics are for those 5 million people, because it's going to be one of the I think, ways in which we sustain things like sales tax revenue over time, especially in the second part of my question, when you talk about 76% of revenue coming from sales and use taxes, how does an aging population affect the collection of sales and use taxes? Because if we're in a situation where, especially, I mean, for everyone, the volatility of the stock market and your predictions about the future will influence your spending today. But when you've got a population that is specifically dependent on stock preserving capital in their 401ks and then expending what the growth, how is it that group will spend?
All right, that's a great question. Right now, we have about 4 million people age 65 and older in the state of Florida. That's a round number. By 2030, we're going to have 6 million people. Now, typically, when people get older and move into that age, they spend less on taxable goods and more on services. In other words, they pay to have their lawn mowed so they don't have to get out in the hot weather and do it, those kind of things. And that will change not only our sales tax collection. We need people making money and spending it on flat screen TVs and RVs and all this great stuff they've been buying, because the state gets 6% every time we buy something like that. It's a big number. I mean, what's it, $20 billion in sales and use taxes, more than $20 billion. The other thing is, I think, is super important. I've got a slide that shows Florida's next 4.5 million people and where they're going to go. And this comes out of the University of Florida's Bieber Population Studies Group. I use their numbers just straight up. What's the next 4.5 million people? Well, 3 counties in Florida are going to get a third of that. The dense counties will get denser. We'll have some growth in the smaller counties and the rural counties, but not nearly as much. It's more a relative price kind of move, especially when you go into that. So those are two of the most important things. What are we going to do because people spend less on taxable goods? And by the way, those people vote. Older people vote. Are they going to vote for your infrastructure project that you want unless they directly benefit, it directly benefits them? Is it between their house and their kid's house or their grandkid's house? If it's not, good luck. Are they going to vote for your kid's school to have more money when their kids have left the state or don't live in that county or whatever? That's two of the most important things. And you picked up on two very, very important trends for Florida's future.
If I can just add one comment to that, too. There's some research, I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but it indicates that older people are less tolerant of financial risk. And so we might see portfolios shifting to lower risk asset classes. But I don't know if that overall has a significant effect on the economy. That's just a compositional issue as opposed to an aggregate issue. Last question.
Eric Eichenberg with the Everglades Foundation. Just a parochial question from my perspective, going around the state of Florida and seeing the impact that the environmental concerns that we're seeing. As we know, 3 of the last 6 summers, we've had the algae and the red tide, amongst others. And I know, Dr. Harper, you're dealing with a man-made disaster in the Gulf of Mexico with the Gulf spill. I know Amy Baker has warned that a threat to the Florida economy are man-made disasters like this. So I guess my question, help me, help us as we go around the state. Dr. Parrish in particular, being with the Florida Chamber, local chambers are concerned about the economic impact on their own communities. What is the Florida Chamber doing as it relates to this environmental agenda moving forward, and how can the largest voice for business help move and push the ball forward so that we can tackle some of these issues and ring the bell on the economic concerns that they bring forward?
Okay, sure. That is a great question. First of all, the effect that it has, let's say, we have blue-green algae in one small part of the state. When people poll or in other states, they think the entire state of Florida is just covered, and it costs us. And why that's so important is, it drops down our number of hospitality jobs, and hospitality is who trains people for all other groups in manufacturing and all other industries in Florida. Now, specifically, what's the Florida Chamber doing? I hope you've seen our video series with Dr. Brian LaPointe, where we're talking about those exact issues. Dr. LaPointe, I believe, is out of USF. I hope I hope we got this right. Noted water science, and that's one of the big issues that the Florida Chamber has been working on for quite a while.
We saw that exactly what you're talking about in vivid living color with the BP oil spill. Florida has given up the potential to have offshore drilling exactly because we didn't want to run the risk of soiling our beautiful, clean beaches. And it was pretty gut-wrenching to look at Louisiana, which has collected hundreds of millions of dollars every year in severance fees, the fees for extracting natural resources from under the Gulf of Mexico, and then have a major blowout. So they unfortunately got the benefit of the restore settlements and such for their coastline at the same time as it was kind of a self-inflicted wound. And so Florida has got to do whatever it takes to keep the beaches clean because that's our brand. We lose all those tourism dollars, and the reason that Florida got twice as much in state economic damages as Louisiana did when Louisiana, of course, had the very famous oil-soaked pelican picture circulating, was because tourism is so important to Florida. And as Jerry said, tourists all think that you can drive from Pensacola to Miami for lunch if they're from overseas. And so they just don't understand. Many of them do. Right. So agree with you completely.
And let me just conclude, too. I don't know the answer at all to what you're talking about, but I do think we're all pleased that we have a governor that is making it an issue of significant debate and discussion at the highest levels of elected state politics. I think it's cut across political boundaries, so I think that is very good for Florida, too. And people like yourselves searching, and Dr. Harper and Dr. Parrish, for answers, I'm confident we will find them. We all realize what a significant economic issue this is now, and thank all of you for bringing it to our attention. And we just have to go forward and try to find some good solutions. It'll be a source of economic growth, the solution itself, I believe. It'll lead to brighter days for the state's economy.
Please join me in thanking the Florida Council of Economic Advisors.